Welcome, everyone. We have a real treat today. A guest, friend of mine, and somebody who's really on the inside of the government and all the way from the early days of 9/11, Juan Zarate, to do this Google Hangout with us. Juan, thank you so much for being with us.
David, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
So Juan was a prosecutor in the Maine Justice Department prior to 9/11. In August of 2001, he moved over to the Treasury Department. He'll tell you a little bit about what he was doing. And then in the second Bush administration, he became one of the key White House counterterrorism advisors. So we'll post his full bio for all students to see, but you can see he's really got a depth of experience. And we're very, very fortunate that he could spare the time to be with us today. So Juan, if I could start, maybe it'd be best to kind of tell everyone a little bit about what you were doing when you came over the Treasury and what your perspective was in the weeks leading up to 9/11.
Well, thank you, David. It's great to be with everybody. I was very fortunate. I was a young prosecutor. I joined Maine Justice in what was then called the Terrorism and Violent Crime Section to look at and prosecute, investigate terrorism cases, international terrorism cases. I was super lucky in that I was able to join the team that was looking at the embassy bombings case to help prosecute that. That was being prosecuted out of New York, but I was sort of added to the team to help at a very junior level in 1999. And so from a very early stage of my professional career, I was looking at al-Qaeda attacks, the use of prosecutions to look at gathering intelligence and information on al-Qaeda. But more importantly, as my career at the Justice Department progressed, later working on the USS Cole investigation, that was the attack in October 2000 on the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, really got a glimpse of a group that was growing in significance, growing in its capabilities, and certainly more and more brazen in its attacks on the U.S. And I remember a number of us internally who were looking at these cases being very sort of open with each other about sort of the growing crescendo of threats and growing crescendo of attacks that we had seen, and literally talking about the fact that this group was at war with us, and we were in some ways not sort of being as responsive as we could be, and certainly felt a little bit defensive about where we stood. As you mentioned, David, in August of 2001, I was asked to join the Treasury Department. I did that. It was a little bit of an odd move because I was a prosecutor looking at these terrorism cases. Didn't quite know what the Treasury did, but I was asked to come on board to look at the international enforcement issues and to help the leadership at the Treasury to look at things like money laundering, sanctions, international organized crime from a money perspective, from the perspective of illicit finance, and to see what we could do from an enforcement vantage point. And so that's what I went over in late August 2001 to do. 2.5 weeks later, we had 9/11, and I was on the 4th floor of the Treasury Department looking south over the Potomac, watching the black smoke billow from the Pentagon when that happened. And then we evacuated the Treasury Department, and you know, our world was never the same again. And certainly the Treasury Department was never the same again, because we went into full mode to look at how we could use Treasury tools and powers to undercut the ability of al-Qaeda to plot other attacks and to expand its reach. And so I was very fortunate to be in some places where I could at least try to have an impact on our policy.
Well, let's just look at even at those earliest days. You know, the 9/11 Commission report, one of the titles of its chapter is the light was blinking red. You know, being in, you know, even for a short couple of weeks in a position where you were maybe seeing intelligence and things like that, was that the sense when you got to Treasury that the light was blinking red, that there was an idea that an attack might be imminent, and there was a frantic search for clues at that point?
I think there was a sense in the counterterrorism community, and certainly those of us who prior to 9/11 had been looking at al-Qaeda, that al-Qaeda was growing in its power and in its desire to hit the United States in more dramatic and significant ways. keep in mind Al-Qaeda has in mind a strategy of forcing the United States to alter its policy in the Middle East and North Africa, very much trying to alter our strategy long term. And so there was a very clear sense, at least those of us who were watching this, that there was something building. Now, I don't want to pretend that I was in the inner sanctum seeing the presidential daily briefs or anything like that, which I wasn't. So I didn't see some of the reports that later came out under the 9/11 Commission report and investigation. But certainly prior to 9/11, and I think in those summer days, I think there was a sense that Al-Qaeda was still looming and that there was a threat present. At Treasury, I don't think we were yet focused on exactly how that was going to manifest itself, but that certainly became a focus after 9/11.
So then the attacks take place, and of course, as I told you, students are thinking this week about what the policy challenges were to the administration when they woke up on the morning of September 12th, 2001. I know you were at Treasury, but you have a very broad knowledge of all these areas. Can you try to give a sense of, for high-level decision makers, a catastrophe of this magnitude happens? How is the president thinking about this? What are they trying to manage? What are the priorities in the early days of a disaster of this magnitude?
Right. I think it's important to keep in mind that September 12, 2001, and then a year to 2 years out was really dominated in the policymakers' minds and certainly the president's mind with the notion that we could never let this happen again. And certainly that became the theme of the Bush administration, that you could never allow this to happen again. But what was overriding in terms of a sense, both not only for policymakers but also for the intelligence community, was that we actually didn't know what was coming. That September 12th was a period of actually great fear and blindness in terms of what Al-Qaeda might be planning next. I remember the sensibility that day, frankly, walking back to the Treasury Department, where the streets in Washington, there was some activity, but it felt a bit like a ghost town, and you had some military vehicles driving up and down the streets and the avenues in Washington. We were in a very different period, and there was a great foreboding and sense of dread as to what was coming next. And I remember looking at the calendar, and each month that we passed without another attack, I think we counted as a lucky month. So I think one of the overriding themes, and I think it's important for students to keep in mind, was just how blind the American government felt as to what was coming next. And the overarching then policy goals of trying to gather as much information that would allow us to divine what may be coming, as well as the ability then to disrupt activities. The very notion of actionable intelligence became sort of the coin of the realm in this period, and I think that then drove a lot of the policy decisions that followed.
So was it were the focus then on how do we get information, or also defensive measures? How do we, if something is happening, what are we going to do to try to stop it before, as we often say, to the left of the boom, before something actually occurs?
Right. Yeah, I think an easy way of thinking about it is you had three categories of activities then, as policymakers were thinking about it. First was gathering as much information and intelligence about not just ongoing plots, but the network itself. How is Al-Qaeda actually distributed? How have they embedded themselves either in the United States or elsewhere? And how are they going to manifest the next threat? And what does that look like? And keep in mind, when we hit 9/11, we had seen the escalation of attacks. And so the fear was that you were going to see a further escalation, that 9/11 wasn't sort of the end of the story. It was just part of a progression. And so that first bucket was really, let's get as much information as we can about the plots and the networks. Two, let's figure out how we can disrupt it. And that means sort of all of government powers and influence to try to do that. At Treasury, it meant let's go after the finances. Let's figure out how we can disrupt money flows so that it interrupts their plots, interrupts their networking. It also meant using intelligence more actively. How can we arrest more people? How can we get them? Third, I think it was a question of, okay, how do we root this out longer term? Al-Qaeda had established a safe haven in Afghanistan. That's obviously going to have to be dealt with. Al-Qaeda has roots in other parts of the world. How do we build the partnerships and capabilities to uproot them and deal with them then? There was really a sense that we have to deal with the immediate to defend the U.S., to defend ourselves, but also then to how do we reach out to affect and disrupt Al-Qaeda abroad. And in that same vein, David, as you mentioned, the defensive question was, well, how do we build up our defenses at ports, at borders, and that then later leads to the debate about creating a new Department of Homeland Security.
So you talked about how this had to be, by its nature, a whole of government type of approach. How does a president, and ultimately in the second administration you were closer to the White House, so you have some ideas about this, how does the president actually try to organize that, to direct a whole of government approach to a new problem? What are some of the difficulties in doing that? I think, from the layperson, they say, well, the president barks out an order and all of a sudden it happens. But it's not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. But the president has certain authorities and mechanisms, obviously, at his command that certainly help. And certainly what the president did was rely very heavily on his National Security Council. That is in the 1947 Act that created the council. These are the senior cabinet members, like the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, head of the CIA, and others who are part of his national security cabinet, if you will, who then have the authority to do certain things. And what the president does and what the cabinet does is look at the authorities and capabilities at hand as to how to deal with a problem. And so the Secretary of State has the remit to do diplomacy abroad on behalf of the president. That's all the tools available. The Secretary of Defense has the military at his command at the behest of the president. So what military tools do you have available? The intelligence community, at the time coordinated by the CIA, later by the Director of National Intelligence, has the intelligence resources. Other elements of the government, like the Treasury Department, had certain responsibilities. So the president looks at his authorities, tries to develop a strategy, often driven by National Security Council staff and internally, to say, okay, how do we get at this problem short-term, long-term, and what are the tools and authorities we have? Importantly, David, in this period, there was also a very clear and important discussion about what authorities don't we have that we need. And that leads to this important question as to how to view the problem of terrorism. And President Bush made very clear that he was going to view this as a war on terror. That is to say, this wasn't just a rhetorical tool. This was a real sort of paradigmatic shift to say, we need the ability to use military tools and capabilities against this threat. And that leads to the authorization for the use of military force by Congress, September 18, 2001, and leads to, obviously, the invasion of Afghanistan and all sorts of other tools that were used under military authority. And so the president will look at his authorities, look to his cabinet to help organize it, his national security advisor to help coordinate the strategy, and then you implement. And I think the hardest part of governance from the president's point of view is making sure that the strategies, the tools, his dictates then get implemented into strategy, and that you have the cooperation of Congress to help do that.
Well, let's go back a little bit in your discussion about how it was this effort was framed as a war on terror. It's interesting because you listed 4 or 5 different things. You talked about diplomacy, you talked about Treasury, you talked about law enforcement, defensive measures, and of course then you also mentioned military. But a lot of the authority, or a lot of the things that needed to be done, were non-military. So how did that work into, or why was it then necessary to frame this conflict in terms of a war?
I think, David, the challenge the president had at that time was you clearly had the intelligence community, law enforcement community focused on Al-Qaeda and terrorism. And in a sense, and harken back to my experience prior to 9/11, there was a counterterrorism community that was trying to deal with this issue. The reality was, though, that we hadn't dealt with the problem with military tools in addition to the intelligence collection, in addition to the work of the FBI, in addition to the work of prosecutors. And so there were certain tools and activities to include not just military but also treasury tools that needed to be amplified to go after this problem more aggressively. And I think part of this was a paradigmatic shift, not just toward the labeling of this as a war on terror, to allow the use of military tools and authorities more aggressively, but also a shift to a more preventative, predictive paradigm to how we were dealing with terrorism. And so the proposition was no longer how do we react to an attack, how do we investigate it, how do we get intelligence about it to hold people accountable post facto. The shift became not just let's use military force, but let's figure out how we use our tools to prevent these attacks. And that's why you see significantly within the FBI itself a shift toward a more intelligence gathering mode, as we've heard in the Homeland Security context, intelligence-led policing, to allow a more preventative paradigm to say, look, we're not going to let this happen again. We're going to do everything to prevent it and to disrupt it before the threats reach our shores. And I think that was a really important paradigmatic shift, which is still having implications for how we think about law enforcement, intelligence, and military force today.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of those themes will come out in the second course that I'm going to be offering, 9/11 and its Aftermath Part 2, which will focus a lot on those things. But let me just stick on this on one other point. Was there any discussion, or do you think there's any considerations of the potential costs of using the term war and implementing this paradigmatic shift to more preventative, that how this effort would be perceived abroad, and whether in some ways it could complicate some of our desires to both tamp down the popularity of the al-Qaeda ideology, to gain cooperation of other states whose populations might not be very receptive to a United States-led war in the Middle East and other places in the Muslim world. Do you think those considerations were made, and if so, how were these potential downsides kind of dealt with in this framing of the conflict to come?
It's a great question, and there's no question. And I fast forward a little bit to my experience at the White House, maybe a precursor to your second course, and I encourage students to take it. But that was a huge part of the debate when I arrived in the White House, and I was in the middle of that debate as to the lexicon of what we were calling this. And part of that debate at the time in 2004, 2005 was, you know, this is a longer term issue. This isn't just about disrupting a terrorist camp in Kandahar or a particular plot that may be coming to us from Europe. This is about a movement that is ideologically driven, that is trying to inspire a broader sort of movement globally, and that presents potentially a generational risk, and that this is more a battle of ideas just as much as a battle of arms at the end of the day. And so we need to think through how we construe that, how we talk about it, how we label it. But back to 2001, I think the greatest consideration at that point was simply how do we articulate what we're going to be doing as a nation that has both legal, political, and social consequence. And I think what is often lost in the debate about the terminology here is that the president very much saw the need to use the war lexicon to not only animate new tools like the military that we hadn't used against al-Qaeda in the past, to justify in the minds of the public invading Afghanistan, for example, but also to express a real desire that we are going to use all elements of power, to include military power, to root out this problem. And in a sense, this is where I differ with some of the critics about the use of the term war on terror, because one of the things that the president was very much conscious of was sort of the impact here and how, for example, our European allies in particular chafed at the notion of a militant sort of notion of going after terrorism. In particular, when you had terrorist cells in cities like Paris or London, you know, you're not going to drop a bomb on somebody, so what does this really mean? But, you know, the president, in addition to wanting to give sort of a framing for how we were using military force, also wanted to say, look, terrorism in the 21st century can be cataclysmic, and we have to find a way of delegitimating the very notion that there is legitimacy in the use of terror, that is to say, violence directed at civilians for mass effect, that can no longer be acceptable given what we just witnessed on 9/11 and given the potential of, for example, WMD and terrorism blending. And so for the president, it was animating this notion that we're going to use the military, we're going to use all elements of national power, it's going to be global. But it's also a conceptual battle against the very notion that terrorism can be legitimate. And I think that's often lost in the debate, and it was part of the debate in 04-05 when people were saying, look, we need to shift the lexicon here. You know, the president was very clear, look, we are at war. We're at war with the ideology. We're at war with a group of people who are at war with us. And if we're going to be using military force, we're going to be putting men and women in harm's way. We have to call it for what it is. We can't shy away from that. And we have to deal, obviously, with the consequences, but we can't ignore what it is that we're doing.